Right now, a ceasefire is holding the Middle East together with what amounts to a thread, and most people celebrating it have no idea how close that thread is to snapping. 2 weeks. That is the window the world has been given, and every headline is calling it peace. But a pause is not peace. A pause is just the silence before the next move, and the next move is already being prepared. If this is helping you understand what's really happening, please hit subscribe. Many of you know what this channel has been building toward. If you want to support the work, there's a link in the description. I've spent months mapping what comes after this ceasefire, after the negotiations, after the silence breaks. Everything is inside an ebook called The Next Global Shift: How to Stay Ahead of Economic Collapse and War, the timelines, the pressure points, the decisions you need to make before the window closes. If you want that link, it's in the description. But to understand where this is going, you first have to understand how we actually got here. The story does not begin in February. It begins in 2018, when the United States walked away from the only diplomatic framework that had ever put a ceiling on Iran's nuclear program. The JCPOA did not survive Trump's first term, and from the moment it collapsed, the trajectory between Washington and Tehran moved in one direction only. Sanctions tightened, enrichment accelerated. Iran crossed every red line the international community had drawn, and the international community responded by drawing new ones. By 2025, Iran had accumulated enough highly enriched uranium to build multiple nuclear weapons if it chose to cross the final threshold. That was the clock everyone was watching, and in June of 2025, the United States and Israel decided to stop watching it. The 12-day war that June was described publicly as a surgical campaign. American bombers hit Iran's key nuclear facilities. A ceasefire arrived on June 24th, brokered by the United States and Qatar, and the world told itself the problem had been managed. It had not been managed, it had been compressed. Iran's enrichment infrastructure was damaged, not destroyed, and the political will inside Tehran to rebuild came back harder and faster than Washington had anticipated. Then January 2026 arrived and changed everything that came before it. The protests that erupted across Iran in January were unlike anything the country had seen since the revolution that created the Islamic Republic in 1979. Iranians poured into the streets in numbers that overwhelmed the security apparatus at first. The government's response when it came was brutal. Security forces opened fire, tens of thousands of people died. The images reached the world in real time, and Trump responded the way he had signaled he would. The largest American military deployment to the Middle East since 2003 began moving into position: carrier groups, bomber squadrons, logistical infrastructure that takes weeks to build and does not get built unless someone has already decided it will be used. Talks happened anyway, indirect nuclear negotiations running through Oman, with the Omani foreign minister publicly stating that real progress was being made. Trump expressed publicly that he was not thrilled with what was on the table. The talks collapsed. The decision, it became clear later, had already been finalized before anyone sat down to negotiate. February 28, 2026. At 6:35 in the morning, UTC, U.S. Central Command confirmed airstrikes against Iran. Not targeted strikes, not a limited campaign. Nearly 900 strikes compressed into a single 12-hour window. The Americans called their operation Epic Fury. The Israelis called theirs Roaring Lion. B-2 stealth bombers, B-1 Lancers, B-52s, Tomahawk cruise missiles, and HIMARS launchers all committed simultaneously against a country that had spent 45 years under Western sanctions and had spent those same 45 years preparing for exactly this moment. 9 minutes after the American strikes began, Israeli jets executed what the IDF described as decapitation strikes. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, 86 years old, supreme leader of Iran since 1989, was killed at his compound. His daughter died with him, his son-in-law, his grandchild, his daughter-in-law. 40 days of national mourning were declared. He was not the only senior figure killed that morning. The Iranian defense minister died in the strikes, the IRGC commander, the defense council secretary, 4 senior Ministry of Intelligence officials. The IDF confirmed 7 senior Iranian security leaders killed before the first public statement was issued. Near Bandar Abbas in southern Iran, a girls' school was struck. Approximately 170 people died. The American and Israeli position was that the school sat next to a military installation and that an Iranian air defense missile had misfired and caused the destruction. Iran's government called it deliberate targeting. By the end of that first day, the Iranian Red Crescent had recorded 201 dead and 747 wounded across 24 provinces, and Iran's response was already in the air. Drones and ballistic missiles launched toward Israel and toward American installations across Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. A drone struck near Britain's Akrotiri base in Cyprus. Missiles were intercepted over Turkish airspace. 3 American service members died that day, the first U.S. combat fatalities of the conflict, and any remaining question about whether this was a war had its answer. What the news cycle failed to hold for more than a few hours was the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest passage, through which approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply moves every single day. Iran closed it. The consequences did not stay in the Persian Gulf. 2 days before the strikes began, on February 26th, AA recorded the national average for a gallon of regular gasoline at $2.98. By early April, that number had crossed $4 for the first time since August 2022, a 39% increase in roughly 5 weeks, with crude oil pushing past $100 a barrel. Japan's prime minister stated publicly that a prolonged closure would exhaust his country's oil reserves within 8 to 9 months. India sources 60% of its oil from that region. China sources 40%. The Strait of Hormuz is not a regional problem. It is everyone's problem. And it was now closed. The leadership question turned out to be the detail that mattered most and received the least attention. Iran's assembly of experts moved quickly. They named Mojtaba Khamenei, 56 years old, the dead supreme leader's son, as his successor. Trump called the appointment unacceptable within hours. What analysts flagged immediately was not the name but the profile. Mojtaba had spent his career inside the Revolutionary Guard's orbit. His reputation among those who tracked Iranian politics was consistent: harder in disposition than his father, less interested in negotiation, more committed to the revolutionary ideology that the IRGC had always represented. His first public declaration as supreme leader was to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed. This was not a weakened Iran recalibrating toward diplomacy. This was Iran under new management that had decided the old management had not been hard enough. The toll kept accumulating through early April. Iran had launched more than 5,000 drones, over 2,000 ballistic missiles, and more than 50 cruise missiles at targets across the region, according to figures from the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Qatar, one of the world's leading natural gas exporters, announced it would require years to restore its production capacity after Iranian strikes dismantled its energy infrastructure. The Gulf states that had spent decades constructing reputations as stable, investable, globally connected economies watched those reputations fracture under sustained missile fire. The business case for the Gulf had rested on the assumption of security. That assumption was now gone. April 7, 2026 produced the moment that stopped everything. Trump posted on Truth Social ahead of an 8 p.m. Eastern deadline. The words were, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again." Congressional Democrats described the post as a potential war crime before the deadline had even passed. Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope, appeared in St. Peter's Square and called for an immediate halt to what he described as attacks on civilian infrastructure, framing the destruction as a reflection of hatred, division, and the collapse of basic human restraint. Less than 2 hours before Trump's deadline expired, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif stepped into the gap. His government operated as the direct intermediary between Washington and Tehran, and the framework held. A ceasefire was announced. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi publicly thanked Sharif by name. Behind the public acknowledgement, reporting indicated that China had delivered the final pressure that pushed Tehran to accept the terms. Trump's announcement on Truth Social described it as a double-sided ceasefire and stated that all military objectives had been met and exceeded, with a long-term peace agreement actively in progress. Iran's Supreme National Security Council confirmed the ceasefire and simultaneously declared victory, stating that nearly all of Iran's war objectives had been achieved. Both sides claimed to have won. Neither side agreed on what winning meant. Markets responded immediately. Brent crude fell more than 13%, settling near $94.74. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 1,300 points in a single session, its strongest day since April of the previous year. The financial system exhaled. That exhale lasted less than 24 hours. Lebanon exposed the ceasefire's architecture almost immediately. Within hours of the announcement, Netanyahu's office released a statement confirming Israel's support for the 2-week pause on Iran strikes, and then attached one clause that overrode everything else. The ceasefire did not apply to Lebanon. Israel launched Operation Eternal Darkness against Hezbollah the same day the ceasefire was announced. 254 people died across Lebanon. Over 1,600 were wounded. 92 of those deaths were concentrated in Beirut alone. By April 8th, Israeli strikes on central Beirut had killed at least 182 more people after the ceasefire was supposed to be active. Iran responded by threatening direct strikes on Israel if the Lebanon campaign continued. Iranian state media reported that the Strait of Hormuz reopening, the economic cornerstone the entire ceasefire had been built around, was being suspended because of the Lebanese strikes. Shehbaz Sharif, the man who had constructed the deal, publicly condemned the violations and called on all parties to honor the 2-week window so that diplomacy could function. Iran's Supreme National Security Council issued a statement that required no interpretation. Their forces were positioned, and any miscalculation by the opposing side would be answered with full force. The nuclear question sat underneath all of it, unresolved and structurally immovable. All of Iran's highly enriched uranium remained inside the country, likely buried beneath the enrichment sites that American bombers had struck the previous June. Trump stated publicly that the United States intended to work with Iran to excavate and remove that material. Iran issued no confirmation. Trump and Netanyahu had entered the conflict demanding complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. Iran's 10-point peace proposal, the formal document Tehran submitted as its ceasefire conditions, rejected that demand without qualification. The original justification for nearly 900 strikes in a single morning remained exactly where it had been before those strikes were launched, unresolved. The Pentagon submitted a supplemental funding request exceeding $200 billion. That number does not reflect a government planning for a conflict that is ending. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard testified before the Senate that Iran's conventional military capacity had been largely destroyed, and then added the sentence that most coverage moved past quickly. The regime, she said, appears intact. Here is what gets left out of every ceasefire announcement. The people who had no vote in any of this. Over 600 dead in Lebanon, more than 1 million displaced, 1/6 of an entire country's population with nowhere to go. Qatar's energy infrastructure in ruins. Gulf economies that took decades to build quietly coming apart. And a global inflation warning from the IMF that says every 10% rise in energy costs pushes prices higher for everyone on Earth, regardless of which side of the conflict they live on. Your grocery bill does not care where the missiles landed. 2 weeks. That is what this agreement actually is, not a peace deal, a deadline. Two sides that both announced victory, sitting across a table with a new Iranian supreme leader who is harder than the one before him, with Lebanon burning inside a ceasefire that technically does not cover it, with the Strait of Hormuz reopening contingent on conditions that are already being violated, and with a $200 billion Pentagon request that suggests Washington is not done. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on all parties to honor the agreement and expressed hope the window would be extended. The window is open. The question nobody is asking loudly enough is what happens the moment it closes.